Well, lads, hope we are doing well, and welcome to this week's episode, which is a Q&A episode. And the first question for this week is, how do I calculate my carb needs for different session types? For example, easy cardio, intervals, heavy lifts, or long team training sessions. I can see where this question is coming from the idea that carbohydrates are going to be the main energy source that's providing the energy at the rate needed to support intense training, for example. So with that, you would come to a good conclusion to say that the amount of energy you're consuming in the form of carbohydrates specifically should be in some way tied to the amount of energy that you're putting out within a training session, for example, or within a given day, a given week, or whatever amount of time you want to look at. But there are a few caveats I would recommend before going down the route of adjusting your calories and your carbs for each and every individual session. The first one is to say that altering your carb intake on a day-to-day basis is what I would say advanced nutrition strategy for the most part. So if you are currently at a level where your nutrition isn't very good on an ongoing basis, then I would caution you from looking too specifically at the alteration of your carbohydrates based on the training load for that day, because things can be difficult enough when addressing your nutrition, especially at the start, without you adding in more complications to it that aren't going to make a huge difference compared to the changes that you could be making that are going to make a big difference at the start. Specifically is things like your ongoing nutrition in terms of the quality of food you're taking in, your ongoing calorie and energy intake, your ongoing carbohydrate intake, and how that's supporting your general ongoing training. I would also give the caveat that the idea of looking at how many calories you're burning within a session, specifically relating that to how many carbs you're burning and then trying to eat based on that, can lead to a lot of headache and a lot of unnecessary headache, specifically if you're looking at your smartwatch or your Whoop and it's telling you how many calories you're burning and you're almost trying to either make that back or predict how many you're going to burn in a session, therefore eat to suit that. Again, it's overcomplicating things compared to the benefit that you might even get from it, if there is any benefit. Now, with that said, when I am working with an athlete and we have their baseline nutrition at a really solid level on an ongoing basis, meaning they are supporting the amount of energy output they are putting out on a daily basis as well as within their training sessions with the appropriate amount of ongoing calorie intake. We're also breaking that down into the macronutrient components, one of them being carbohydrates here, that is appropriate for their level of activity and the type of activity, the intensity and the volume of activity they're doing. Once we have those things in place, we can then start to look at how we are modulating their intake, specifically carbohydrates in this case, based on that day's training. But as opposed to it being something where you're looking at each session and asking how many calories and carbs you expect to expend and therefore trying to relate it to that in terms of how much you're taking in, what we simply do is have maybe 2 to 3 different intake targets throughout the week. This could be, for example, your regular daily intake, which is day where you're not training, or maybe you're just doing a gym session, for example. We might have done a higher intake on specific training days where you are expected to have high energy output. These would be like team training sessions or longer and more intense runs if you're a runner. And then we might have a third intake that's a carb loading intake for before a match day if you're a GA player, for example, or before a really long run if you are a runner. So there are ways in which we can do that keep it relatively simple without it being overly complicated, and still getting the benefits of taking your intakes up on a given day to support the training of that day, and potentially down on certain days where we don't need it as much. With that said, there is a third level that people can get to, and this is what I would encourage with the athletes that I work with longer term, is to get to the point where you have subjective ability to increase or decrease your calorie intake based on the training level that you are doing. And this might look like simply eating more or eating less without it being a specific amount of carbs or amount of calories on a given day based on that day's training load. But what I would say is that this takes a lot of time to get to the point where you can do this with some level of accuracy and consistency, and takes a lot of awareness around nutrition and good habits to be built up before that is the case. So in summary, I wouldn't recommend for someone who is already struggling with other things with their nutrition to start looking at how they can implement different carb intakes on different days based on the training load. But once you have your overall nutrition, your ongoing nutrition in a good place, you can then start to look at separating your heavy training days from your light training days and your rest days and carb loading days, and having specific targets for them so that you can get the benefits without overcomplicating it too much. And then what you can do is potentially get to the point where you're able to be a little bit more flexible with it, a little bit more intuitive with it, so that you're getting some of the benefits without it being something that is having to be tracked on an ongoing basis. Second question then is, I struggle with cramping in the last 5 minutes of a game. Is there anything I should do nutrition wise to sort this out? So cramping is one of those things that the jury is out on as to exactly what causes it. And many people will say it's down to things like hydration or electrolyte levels, but I haven't yet been convinced of that from the evidence. And in lieu of knowing exactly what causes cramping, my way of thinking about it is that cramping is almost like the body's signal that a particular muscle is very close to its maximum capacity. It's almost like your body's last ditch effort to get you to stop using that muscle before it then might experience further, more extreme damage. And if we think about it that way, it could tell us that cramping could be down to a number of issues. It could be down to the idea that your muscle, that specific muscle, is slightly lacking in local muscular endurance or even strength, or it could be that you're overutilizing that muscle relative to what would be optimal because of certain movement patterns that you're engaging in. Or it could be just the case that it is almost the weakest link in the chain of your body in general, and when the body as a whole starts to fatigue, the first place to go is that particular muscle that you're finding is cramping on an ongoing basis. And where nutrition comes into it is a little bit closer to that more general aspect that I talked about there, where if you're not fueling optimally, if you're not hydrating optimally, and your body is in a state where it is less than optimal for athletic performance, then the cramping can be something that sets in earlier than it otherwise would have. So in the same way that you might address cramping in a specific muscle by looking at, is that muscle strong or endurant enough? Are you moving in such a way that it's not your body's not over reliant on that muscle for a particular movement versus or relative to other muscles that could be taking up more of the load? In the same way that you might improve your overall fitness as a way of delaying the time at which cramping sets in, you will also want to be addressing your nutrition in such a way that your fueling is as good as possible, that your hydration is as good as possible, and that your micronutrient levels are as good as possible, such that you are pushing off the point at which your body fatigues, and therefore the point at which that muscle fatigues, and therefore the point at which cramping occurs. So whilst that doesn't necessarily give any concrete examples or strategies or tactics to decreasing cramping in a specific muscle, I feel that I would probably be remiss to actually give specific recommendation around that, given the evidence base that is there. And instead, what I would say is focusing on your nutrition as a whole in terms of your fueling on an ongoing basis, your fueling pre-match, pre-training, or intra-training fueling, your overall food quality, your hydration, your sleep, and all of these things that are going to benefit every aspect of your physiology and your performance. That will help likely to delay or alleviate the symptoms of cramping. There is some evidence that suggests some strategies and specific tactics that can help with addressing cramping in the given moment, such as things like pickle juice or salt at that time of cramping. But again, the evidence isn't really strong enough for me to be comfortable recommending those things specifically. Third question then is, the manager says I need to gain a stone over the off season. Do you have any advice about how to go about this? I actually had a client recently who said the exact same thing, basically saying that the county manager had come to them and saying, if you want to make the county team for next year, you're going to have to gain a stone by Christmas. And I have to say, I think that was probably a less than optimal approach for that manager. I can see where they're coming from, where they feel that the player needed an extra bit of weight or an extra bit of muscle, an extra bit of strength in order to keep up with the hard knocks of senior football and county football specifically. But to boil it down to that one metric of body weight and make it a necessary thing for them to progress within their playing career without even looking at the idea of how that muscle is gained, and we're not giving them resources and the tools to help them do that, I felt that it was a bit careless. And instead, presumably what the manager was wanting for the player was to come back stronger, was to come back with more muscle mass, and was to do it in a way that would have a positive effect on their performance. But by giving them that one metric, it could have left the athlete in a place where they felt that they were going to gain that weight by all means and, eat as much food as possible, end up gaining a lot of body fat, maybe not training in a way that was useful for their athletic development, and ending up coming to the team but actually being in a worse position from a performance standpoint than if they had just stayed at the same body weight. But what we did was we took the focus off that one stole goal completely, because realistically it would be easy to hit that by just adding in a load of junk food, adding in a load of food in general, and getting a load of body fat on. What we wanted to do was get some body weight on, and hopefully as close to that one stone as possible, but do it in a way that was mostly muscle mass, or as much muscle mass as possible, and do it in a way that was going to, again, improve their overall athletic development. What we did firstly, what we've done actually, because this process is still ongoing, we've ensured that he has a really solid gym program in place that's biasing that weight gain towards muscle gain. So a hypertrophy based training program with still some movements in there that are going to encourage that athleticism as such, as a general concept. We've also aimed for a modest, but probably on the high end, target weight gain of about 2 kilograms per month, knowing that really to go beyond that is likely to lead to more fat gain than muscle gain for most people. That's meant increasing his calorie intake to about 3,700 calories at the minute. Now, don't take that as anything relative to you, because it'll be completely different for one person versus another, but we found that is the level that is getting him to gain the weight at the rate that we want to. And we've also ensured, obviously, that those calories contain sufficient protein to assist in the muscle growth and recovery process, as well as ensuring that it is relatively high in carbohydrates, which it's likely to be anyway, just at that level of calorie intake, and still keeping enough good healthy fat in there to ensure that it's at sufficient levels to cover off any of the biological processes for which it's necessary. We're still working at the moment on getting in more fruit and veg, more fiber, etc., which can be very difficult in a time where you are eating a lot of food, because of how filling the fiber can be and the fruit and veg can be relative to how many calories it's providing. So we're still working through that and ways of getting in plenty of micronutrients and fiber while still going through this process. And we've utilized a few supplements that are relevant to his goals, things like caffeine before training to make sure that the training is of high quality and just give that an extra boost for it, creatine, and some specific vitamin and minerals as well. And we will see where we end up at come Christmas when he returns to the team, whether he's up by that full 1 stone or not. I'm confident that regardless of whether it is or not, the management will be hopefully impressed and satisfied with the progress that he has made. Thanks for listening. If you'd like more free resources or info about my performance nutrition coaching program, hit the link in the podcast description.